Chapter 1. Wedding Bells and Whispers. The bells of St. Mildred's rang out across Little Densworth, bright and insistent, as if the very village itself were determined to remind all within hearing that this was a day for festivity. Along the ivy-clad lanes came villagers in their Sunday best, hats trimmed with feathers and ribbons, shoes polished till they shone. For this was the wedding of Clara Latimer, daughter of the wealthy but somewhat overbearing Lionel Latimer, whose grand house at the edge of the village had long been the subject of both admiration and envy. A Latimer wedding was not an everyday occurrence, and the villagers were as eager for the spectacle as for the bride's happiness. Miss Jane Marple, a distant cousin of Mrs. Weatherby of Densworth Cottage, had accepted an invitation to attend. She sat primly in the pew beside her old friend, her neat straw hat trimmed with violet ribbon, her expression one of mild interest. She had, over her many years, seen countless weddings, and she knew well that the bloom of flowers and the rustle of silk often concealed other, sharper notes beneath. The church was fragrant with lilies and roses, their scent mingling with beeswax polish and the faint tang of candle smoke. Near the altar, an extravagant bouquet of lilies, roses, and orange blossom had been prepared for the bride, a creation that made Mrs. Price Ridley whisper audibly to Mrs. Pritchard that it must have cost an absolute fortune, and all quite wasted on a girl who never had the good sense to smile. Mrs. Pritchard, in her best grey silk, pursed her lips. "It is said Clara is marrying beneath her, you know. The groomspeople, country stock, quite ordinary, no connection to speak of. But Mr. Latimer insisted. They say the young man is steady, and she would not be persuaded otherwise." Behind them, Miss Perkins, the postmistress, hissed to her neighbour, "Steady, perhaps, but I hear there was another admirer once, a certain Captain Ashby. Such a pity, so very dashing. I should not be surprised if he appears yet uninvited." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap bag. She had brought her knitting for the long drive. Her eyes, bright under her hat brim, lingered not on the gossipers, but on the bouquet itself, so carefully tied with satin ribbon, its stems bound with a little silver charm. She noted the way the florist's assistant had hesitated before setting it down, glancing nervously at the pews as though someone's gaze troubled her. The organ swelled, and the congregation rose. Clara entered on her father's arm, pale and composed, her veil trembling slightly as she walked. Behind her, the bridesmaids fluttered like a row of pastel butterflies, yet when the vicar turned to present the bouquet, it was gone. A murmur rustled through the pews. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her neighbour's arm. "It was there just a moment ago." The verger scurried in confusion, lifting altar cloths and peering behind the rail. The bridesmaids tittered nervously, then fell silent at the vicar's frown. Mr. Latimer's face grew purple, his lips pressed tightly. Miss Marple, leaning ever so slightly forward, saw the satin ribbon that had bound the bouquet lying on the floor, torn cleanly, as though plucked away by a purposeful hand. The bells still rang faintly through the open doors, but in the hush of the church, a single thought seemed to move like a whisper from pew to pew. Why would anyone want to steal a bride's bouquet? Miss Marple folded her gloved hands together and thought, with her usual quiet clarity, a wedding, after all, is not merely the union of two hearts. It is the meeting of many histories, many grievances, and sometimes the stirring of secrets long buried. Chapter 2. Bouquet of Suspicions. The vanishing of the bouquet might have been a trifling matter, a prank, a misplacement, had it not been for the atmosphere of dread that followed. The service faltered as the vicar, with admirable composure, pressed on without the flowers. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and Clara Latimer became Clara Dawes. Yet beneath the solemn words ran an undercurrent of whispers, rustles, and sideways glances. When at last the bride and groom emerged from St. Mildred's to the peal of bells, the rice and the cheers of villagers, no one spoke of the kiss or the pretty bridesmaids. All the talk was of the missing bouquet. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to declare with relish, it was sabotage. Someone meant to embarrass the Latimers, mark my words. Such a shameful thing indeed on a wedding day of all times, Mrs. Pritchard nodded. And who has the most to gain by such humiliation? Why, none other than poor Captain Ashby. Jilted men are dangerous creatures. But Ashby was not even present, objected Miss Perkins. And besides, if anyone had cause, it was young Alice from the florist's. She had been sighing over Mr. Dawes for months. Perhaps she thought to spoil Clara's day. At this, Mrs. Weatherby shook her head. Alice is a good girl, merely dreamy. She would never do such a cruel thing. No, if you ask me, there is more here than meets the eye. A bouquet may conceal all manner of things. Miss Marple, seated quietly amid the chatter, listened with that slight tilt of the head which always suggested she heard more than she showed. To her the matter was no prank. She remembered the florist's assistant's nervousness, the torn ribbon on the church floor, the bouquet's careful construction. Bouquets did not simply vanish in a crowded church, unless someone meant them to. Her thoughts were interrupted when Lionel Latimer himself strode into the vestry, face still florid from the ordeal. "Inspector Graves will be called," he announced to his brother-in-law. This was not accident. This was insult to my name, to my family. And it shall not go unpunished. The words carried, as he perhaps intended. There was a rustle among the ladies. Gossip, like perfume, spread swiftly in such company. The name Graves lent gravity. The reception at Latimer House, though grand in its setting, carried the same air of unease. The cake was cut, the champagne poured, but people spoke in subdued tones. Every eye seemed to dart towards the bride, pale but determined, or towards her husband, who attempted gaiety but succeeded only in stiffness. More than one guest remarked that Clara had seemed startled even before the bouquet went missing, her gaze wandering nervously towards the pews, and more than one whispered that perhaps the bouquet had not been stolen from her at all, but rather for her. Miss Marple, accepting a modest glass of sherry, considered the point. In her experience, objects so carefully prepared, a diary, a teacup, a bouquet, seldom vanished for mischief's sake alone. They vanished because they held something someone feared might be seen. That evening, when she returned with Mrs. Weatherby to the little cottage, Miss Marple laid aside her gloves and hat and sat quietly by the lamp. "A curious business," Mrs. Weatherby said. "Why, Jane, who on earth would steal flowers?" Miss Marple's needles clicked once or twice before she replied. "Ah, my dear, flowers may hide many things. A love letter, a jewel, a slip of paper, better lost than found. But the thing to ask, always, is not what was taken, but why it was taken at that moment." She looked into the fire, her eyes thoughtful. "And I fancy we shall not have long to wait before the answer makes itself known." Chapter 3. The first suspect, Inspector Graves, arrived the very next morning, his moustache bristling, his notebook at the ready. A wedding day scandal in Little Densworth was hardly of the magnitude to trouble Scotland Yard, but Mr. Lionel Latimer's indignation carried weight. Graves, though no fool, was inclined to take the colonel-like bluster seriously. His first port of call was the village florist. Alice Turner, the young assistant who had prepared the bouquet under her mistress's instructions, turned pale when questioned. "Yes, Inspector," she said, twisting her apron. "I set the bouquet on the altar myself. White lilies, cream roses, and a sprig of orange blossom tied with satin. I remember it clear as day. And what happened then?" Graves pressed. Alice stammered. I thought I saw someone near the vestry door." "Just a shadow. When I looked back, the bouquet was gone." At once the murmurs began. Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had always distrusted the girl's dreamy ways. Mrs. Pritchard pointed out that Alice had once been seen in tears outside the grocer's, likely over some love affair. And Lionel Latimer thundered that such negligence was inexcusable. By afternoon, half the village was convinced Alice had stolen the bouquet herself, whether from jealousy of Clara, longing for the groom, or sheer foolishness. Miss Marple, who had been sitting with her knitting by Mrs. Weatherby's fireside, received the news with her usual mildness. "Poor child," she said softly. "How quick we are to suppose the worst of the young. And yet Inspector Graves has his duty. He sees negligence and opportunity, and he is not wrong. But one must ask oneself, would a nervous girl have had the coolness to snatch the flowers at the very moment the vicar turned away? That strikes me as something else entirely." That evening, Miss Marple walked past St. Mildred's on her way to post a letter. The shadows lay long in the churchyard, the air cool with the scent of autumn roses. She paused near the vestry door, her sharp eyes noting a faint smear upon the stone ledge just beside it, a dark yellow dust, as though from pollen. She bent closer. The smear was too deliberate, too heavy for a mere brushing of flowers in haste, and on the flagstone below lay the smallest scrap of satin ribbon, frayed at one end. Miss Marple straightened, lips pursed. "Ah," she murmured. "A clumsy hand, and not the hand of one used to needle or thread. Interesting, very interesting." At supper, Mrs. Weatherby asked eagerly what she thought. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, Alice Turner may be guilty of daydreams, but she is not guilty of cleverness. No, this was the work of someone quite determined, and who believed the bouquet contained more than flowers. The ribbon was torn away, not cut. That shows haste. And the smear of pollen suggests not reverence, but rough handling. Whoever took it cared nothing for the blossoms themselves, only for what they concealed." Mrs. Weatherby shivered. "But what could a bouquet hide?" Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. "That," she said softly, "is precisely what we must discover." Chapter 4. The Wilted Clue. 2 days after the wedding, the missing bouquet was found. It was Tom Reeves, the sexton's boy, who discovered it while tidying the churchyard. He came running breathlessly to Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, clutching the bundle of withered lilies and roses wrapped in torn satin. "Found it, missus, behind the yew hedge tucked under the old stone bench." "Nearly tripped over it, I did." Mrs. Weatherby clapped her hands in alarm. "Why, Jane, it's the very bouquet." "Oh, how dreadful! Thrown away like rubbish." Miss Marple took it gently, her blue eyes examining each drooping bloom with quiet care. She noted the frayed ribbon, the bruised petals, and, more curious still, Abita, a faint brownish stain upon one of the cream roses, as though some liquid had splashed there and dried. She said nothing at first, only pursed her lips and nodded to Tom to run along. When the boy was gone, she remarked softly, "One must ask oneself, why hide it at all? If it were a prank, the thief would have flaunted it. To tuck it away suggests shame or fear of discovery." Word of the bouquet's reappearance spread like wildfire. By tea-time, half the village had seen it, or at least heard the tale, embroidered with every telling. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that Alice Turner must have lost her nerve and tried to dispose of the evidence. Mrs. Pritchard, more imaginative, whispered that perhaps the bouquet had been meant to conceal poison, a sinister notion that thrilled her audience at the Blue Boar. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, examined the flowers with little patience. "Nonsense," he pronounced. "Foolish prank, nothing more. We'll have Alice admit it before the week's out." But Miss Marple, her knitting needles moving serenely, murmured, "It is most unwise to dismiss the smallest of details. That stain, for instance. It is not of water, nor wine. I fancy we should ask what it covered, and whom it was meant for." That evening, at the Latimer house, Lionel Latimer stormed about his study, red-faced with fury. Clara, pale and withdrawn since the wedding, sat silent in a corner. More than one guest remarked afterward that the bride seemed almost relieved to have her husband draw the household's attention, as though she carried her own secret burden. Miss Marple, who had called politely with Mrs. Weatherby, observed quietly. She noticed Clara's gloves, fine kid leather, but faintly marked with pollen at the fingertips. And when Mrs. Latimer Senior brought in a tray of tea, she observed, too, the quick glance between mother and son, a glance of unease, not triumph. Walking home in the dusky lane, Mrs. Weatherby could not restrain herself. "Well, Jane, what do you think? Was it Alice, after all, or one of those foolish boys who like to cause trouble?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost dreamy. "No, my dear, this was not the work of boys nor of a silly girl. It was the act of someone who feared what the bouquet carried. Flowers are innocent, but they may be vessels. I think we may find that the bouquet bore something less fragrant than lilies." She glanced up at the twilight sky, where the first stars glimmered faintly. "And the curious thing is," she added softly, "that it was never meant for Clara Latimer at all." Chapter 5. Secrets in Satin, the bouquet, once recovered, lay in Inspector Graves's evidence box like any other discarded trifle. To him, it was proof only of Alice Turner's clumsy guilt, but to Miss Marple, it was a book waiting to be read. One morning she asked, in her gentle way, whether she might look at it again. For old ladies have such fondness for flowers. "Inspector," Graves, with the indulgence of a man humouring harmless curiosity, allowed it in Mrs. Weatherby's parlour. Miss Marple laid the wilted blooms carefully upon newspaper. She parted the drooping lilies, lifted the bruised roses, and at last found what she suspected: a small scrap of folded paper, discoloured by damp, but still legible. Mrs. Weatherby gasped. "A note! Why, Jane, what can it mean?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. The paper bore a few words, hastily scrawled: "Meet me by the yew walk at midnight." "Burn this!" There was no signature. By afternoon, the entire village had heard of the note. Speculation leapt in every direction. Mrs. Price Ridley was sure it meant a clandestine love affair. Mrs. Pritchard declared it must be blackmail. Miss Perkins suggested espionage. One never knows in these times. But for Clara Latimer the revelation was more serious. At the Latimer house she grew paler still, and when pressed by her formidable father, she protested too quickly. "I know nothing about it." "Nothing at all." Miss Marple, who had come to pay a call, observed her closely. Clara's eyes darted toward her new husband, then fell to her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The young man, Mr. Dawes, looked bewildered rather than guilty. But bewilderment, Miss Marple knew, could easily be played. Inspector Graves seized on the note as further evidence against Alice Turner. Who else would be handling the bouquet? She slipped it in herself. That proved she was up to mischief. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, disagreed in her mild way. "On the contrary, Inspector, the note was meant to be hidden, not found. Poor Alice would never have risked discovery so foolishly." "No. This was placed there by someone confident the bouquet would never be examined closely," Graves snorted. "And yet it was." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her eyes very bright. "'Cause it vanished." "And that, Inspector, was the mistake. Someone feared the note might be discovered, and so they stole the bouquet." That evening, Miss Marple sat by the window at Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, watching the twilight gather over Little Densworth. She thought of Clara's trembling denial, of Mr. Dawes's awkward silence, of Lionel Latimer's purple rage. She thought, too, of Captain Ashby, absent but often named. "Midnight by the yew walk," she murmured to herself. "Such meetings are seldom innocent, and a bouquet is a curious messenger." "It seems we are dealing, my dear," she said softly to her knitting, "with secrets far older than a wedding day." Chapter 6. Midnight in the yew walk, the village of Little Densworth, possessed a certain theatrical love of the mysterious. The yew walk a shaded path lined with ancient dark green trees beside Latimer House, had long been a place of whispered stories. Lovers met there on summer evenings, children dared one another to walk it after dusk, and older villagers spoke of ghosts in hushed tones, so when the words, "Meet me by the yew walk at midnight," were read aloud in Mrs. Weatherby's parlour, imaginations caught fire. Who had been meant to come? Who had sent it? And what had been seen that night? Miss Marple, who had heard much of such tales in St. Mary Mead, chose not to speculate aloud. Instead, she listened. She listened to Clara Latimer's protests, to Mr. Dawes's bewilderment, to Lionel Latimer's outrage. She listened, too, to the village's chatter, which often revealed more than it meant to hide. 2 evenings later, when the moon was high and the garden still, she persuaded Mrs. Weatherby to accompany her on a quiet walk. The yew trees loomed in solemn rows, casting long shadows. Miss Marple paused now and then, peering at the ground with her keen eyes. At one point, she bent down and touched a patch of earth. "Disturbed," she murmured. "And recently, something buried here, or removed." The next morning, Tom Reeves made a discovery that shook the village afresh. While trimming hedges near the yew walk, he found a handkerchief, silk, embroidered with the initials CL, caught upon a low branch. The initials were Clara Latimer's. Inspector Graves seized upon it eagerly. "Clear as daylight." The note was for her. She met someone that night. The bouquet was her excuse, and she has lied about it ever since. The villagers nodded, delighted by the scandal. "Shocking," said Mrs. Pritchard, "to deceive her husband so soon after the vows." But Miss Marple shook her head. "Not so fast, Inspector. If a lady wished to conceal her meeting, would she drop a handkerchief embroidered with her own initials? Such things, you know, are very seldom accidents," Graves scowled. "Are you saying it was planted?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied gently, "that we should ask ourselves who benefits by making Mrs. Dawes appear guilty." That very night, another event unsettled the village. Clara herself fell ill after supper at Latimer House, taken suddenly faint and pale. Dr. Blackwood was called and declared it a digestive upset. Quite natural after the strain of a wedding. Yet Miss Marple, visiting the next day, observed Clara's lips still tinged with a bluish hue, her hands trembling as she reached for a teacup. Miss Marple's eyes rested on that cup a moment longer than anyone else's. She said nothing. But when she and Mrs. Weatherby walked homeward through the dusky lane, she remarked softly, "My dear, I fancy the bouquet was not the only vessel for secrets in Little Densworth, and I fear that whoever hid behind it is not yet finished with their work." Chapter 7. Petals and Poison. The attempted illness of Clara Dawes was, to most of Little Densworth, a trifling matter. "Nerves," said Mrs. Price Ridley knowingly. "A touch of excitement," declared Mrs. Pritchard at the Blue Boar. But Miss Marple was not deceived. She had seen that bluish tinge before, and the trembling hands. It was not nerves. It was poison, administered gently, in a dose meant to alarm rather than kill. And in Miss Marple's mind, the bouquet's hidden note and the stained petals fitted neatly beside this new event. Inspector Graves, however, pursued the obvious. He questioned Clara sternly, waving the handkerchief with its telltale initials. "You must admit, madam, you were in the yew walk that night." "Who were you meeting?" Clara shook her head vehemently. "I never went. I never saw that note." But her protests only sounded to the inspector's ears like guilt. Miss Marple, present in her quiet way, merely observed. She noted the way Clara's husband, Mr. Dawes, glanced at her with bewildered loyalty, and how Lionel Latimer, Clara's father, fixed his gaze on the hearthrug rather than his daughter's pale face. Later, over tea with Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple reflected. The handkerchief, she said softly, was much too neat a clue, as if dropped by a stage actress, hoping the audience might gasp. And the bouquet? Why, that was no gift of flowers at all, but a message-bearer. Someone wished Clara to be thought guilty, both of deceit and of theft. The note, the handkerchief, and now the poisoned cup, all point in one direction. Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward.
You mean someone wants her discredited?
Precisely, and perhaps removed. Miss Marple's needles clicked. The motive, as always, will be quite simple. Money, pride, or jealousy, the oldest poisons of all. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to the church. She lingered in the vestry where the bouquet had vanished, and in the yew walk where secrets were whispered. Near the disturbed patch of soil she had marked before, she bent again, and this time uncovered a small object half buried, a glass vial, its cork stopper stained with a brown residue. She held it up, her eyes calm but resolute. So, she murmured, a bouquet to hide a note and a vial to carry poison, the one concealed within the other, like roses masking their thorns. When she returned to Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, she set the vial on the mantelpiece and resumed her knitting. The village thinks poor Clara foolish and unfaithful, she said gently.
The inspector thinks her deceitful.
But I believe she is merely the puppet, not the hand. We must now look at who gains by her ruin, for that, my dear, will lead us to the hand that tied the bouquet and poured the poison. Chapter 8. The Blooming Trap. It was Miss Marple's custom, when faced with deceit, not to confront it with thunder and accusation, but to lay out a thread of bait and see who would snatch at it. People, she knew, revealed themselves more surely through small gestures than through grand confessions. And so the following Sunday she attended morning service at St. Mary's in Little Densworth. The church was crowded, for curiosity about the wedding scandal had become a sort of sacrament in itself. Clara sat pale and subdued beside her husband, while Lionel Latimer scowled in his pew like a man at war. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the glances exchanged across the aisle. Mrs. Pritchard craned to whisper, Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed disapprovingly, and young Alice Turner, still under suspicion, sat miserably alone, her eyes red from tears. When the service ended, Miss Marple made her move in the churchyard. Beneath the roses that twined along the wall, she said, with apparent innocence, I cannot help but think, my dears, how fortunate it was the bouquet was found before the flowers entirely withered. Why, the little note tucked inside was still legible. Had it been destroyed, the whole affair might have remained a mystery forever. Her words, spoken mildly, rippled through the gathered company. Alice Turner looked startled, Clara bit her lip, Lionel Latimer stiffened. But it was Mrs. Latimer Senior whose hands trembled as she adjusted her parasol. A single tremor, quickly hidden, but not before Miss Marple's sharp eyes had seen it. That afternoon, over tea at Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, Miss Marple explained, You see, my dear, when one dangles a thread, the guilty hand will often twitch. Mrs. Latimer is most anxious. And no wonder, for she, more than anyone, would fear a secret note.
Her son's marriage is her fortress. Anything that threatens it she must silence, Mrs. Weatherby gasped.
You mean it was she who placed the note? Miss Marple shook her head.
Not placed, my dear, removed. The note was genuine, but not intended for Clara. No, it was meant to expose another, and Mrs. Latimer Senior knows it.
That is why she trembled. A guilty conscience betrays itself in the smallest ways. That evening brought confirmation. Miss Perkins, the postmistress, confided to Miss Marple that she had seen Mrs. Latimer near the churchyard late on the wedding night. Said she was praying for the young couple, Miss Perkins reported. But between you and me, she looked more like a cat after cream. Miss Marple's needles clicked rapidly as she considered. So, the bouquet concealed a note. The note threatened a meeting. The bouquet disappeared, only to be found with a stain and a vial nearby. Clara was nearly poisoned, but not fatally. And all the while, Mrs. Latimer's composure frays at the edges. She set her knitting aside, her expression calm but resolute. "It is time, I think, to gather them all and let the truth bloom where it must." Chapter 9. Among the roses, it was not unusual in Little Densworth for villagers to gather in the churchyard on a fair afternoon. But this time the assembly had a more solemn air. Inspector Graves was present, scowling beneath his moustache. Clara and her young husband stood together side by side, though Clara's face was pale. Lionel Latimer loomed at the edge of the group, stiff with indignation, and Mrs. Latimer Senior, in her elegant hat,
held her parasol firmly as though it were a weapon. Miss Marple,
very neat and small among them, spoke with gentle firmness. "My dear friends, I have been troubled by the matter of the vanished bouquet. Such a trifling thing, one might say. And yet, was it trifling? A note concealed in the flowers, a handkerchief left behind, a poisoned cup. These are not trifles, but threads. When one gathers them together, they make a very strong cord indeed." She led them to the yew walk, where the shadows fell cool and long. "Here," she said softly. Someone was to meet another at midnight, but instead of a meeting there was a theft. The bouquet was taken away, and with it the note that should have revealed too much.
Ask yourselves, who feared its discovery most?
No one answered. The silence was broken only by the caw of a rook in the trees. Miss Marple's eyes, very blue beneath her sensible hat, rested on Mrs. Latimer Senior. It was not Clara who arranged the meeting. The note was never meant for her, but someone placed her handkerchief here, quite deliberately, to throw suspicion. A cruel trick, and nearly fatal, for Clara was later given a dose of poison in her own home. Clara gasped. Mr. Dawes gripped her hand. Inspector Graves frowned. "Poison," Miss Marple went on, "is a weapon that speaks of calculation, not passion. It is often employed by those who cannot bear scandal, who dread the loss of position more than anything in the world."
A mother, perhaps, desperate to keep a secret from reaching her son. At this, Mrs. Latimer Senior gave a sharp cry.
Her parasol slipped from her grasp, striking the ground. "You dare!" she whispered. "You dare accuse me when all I sought was to protect my family." Her words faltered. All eyes were upon her. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Yes, madam, you wished to protect your family, but in doing so you sought to destroy another. You feared the note, for it concerned not Clara, but yourself. The bouquet was meant to expose you, and so you silenced it. The poison, the planted handkerchief, the stolen flowers, all to turn suspicion upon an innocent girl." Inspector Graves stepped forward, heavy-voiced.
"Miss Latimer, is this true?"
She sank onto the stone bench, her face drawn.
"I could not let it come out," she whispered.
"Not after all these years. The shame, the ruin. Better Clara be thought guilty than the truth be known." Miss Marple sighed, her knitting needles resting in her lap. "My dear lady, truth has a way of blooming like roses in spring. However hard one prunes, it will break through." The yew trees stood silent witness. In their shadow, the mystery of the vanishing bouquet had at last unfurled, not in beauty, but in thorns. Chapter 10. The final petal. The little party in the yew walk was hushed. Mrs. Latimer Senior sat rigid, her parasol lying forgotten at her feet. Clara clung to her husband's arm, bewildered, but relieved by the shifting of suspicion away from her. Inspector Graves stood squarely waiting, his pen poised above his notebook. It was Miss Marple, of course, who broke the silence. Her voice was low, almost apologetic, yet it carried with quiet authority. "You see, my dears, the matter was never one of flowers at all, though that is how it appeared. The bouquet was merely a convenient vessel, an innocent-seeming place to conceal a message. A message, I must add, that was intended not for Clara, but for another." She looked toward Mrs. Latimer Senior, whose lips pressed tightly together. "The note," Miss Marple continued, "was a summons written by someone who knew an old scandal could be revealed. It instructed a meeting at midnight in the Yew Walk, a place discreet, shadowed, and known for secrecy. The bouquet was delivered into Clara's hands because she was the bride, but the flowers were never meant for her at all. They were meant to pass unnoticed into the Latimer household, where a certain lady could recover the hidden paper. Inspector Graves interjected, "And that handkerchief with the initials?" Miss Marple's needles clicked together once, then she folded them in her lap. "Planted, Inspector. Too neat, too pat."
A clue that screamed its name.
Clara may be thought naive, but she's not so careless. The handkerchief was left to draw attention, so suspicion might fall neatly upon her head. Clara's eyes filled with tears.
Then I wasn't mad. I knew I had nothing to do with it.
"Quite so, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. She leaned forward, her voice soft but steady. Mrs. Latimer feared exposure. Long ago, before her son's marriage, she was entangled in a matter best forgotten, a debt, a betrayal, perhaps even an indiscretion of the heart. The note threatened to bring it all into the open. Rather than face disgrace, she sought to remove it, to destroy the evidence. But in so doing, she created a trail of suspicion, a web that ensnared her own daughter-in-law. There was a stir among the listeners. Mrs. Weatherby gasped.
Lionel Latimer muttered something half inaudible. And the poison?
Inspector Graves pressed. Miss Marple inclined her head. A small vial was hidden near the Yew Walk, as I found. It was used later in Clara's own home, slipped into a teacup, perhaps. Not to kill, but to weaken, to frighten, to make her seem unstable. For if Clara could be discredited, then no one would think to look further. Mrs. Latimer Senior raised her head then, her voice strained but defiant.
I did it for my family's honour.
Better scandal fall on a silly girl than ruin us all. You cannot understand. Miss Marple's eyes were very gentle. On the contrary, madam, I understand all too well. Pride is like a rose. Beautiful, admired, but with thorns that wound those who cling to it too tightly. You clung to your pride, and in doing so you nearly destroyed an innocent life. Inspector Graves snapped his notebook shut. That will be all, Mrs. Latimer. You'll come with me now. There was no struggle. Only a weary resignation as she rose, her parasol left abandoned upon the bench, and allowed herself to be led away. As the company dispersed, Miss Marple remained a moment longer among the roses. She touched one bloom lightly with her gloved hand, noting the perfect petals, the hidden thorns. People, she murmured to herself, are much the same. They will always be beautiful, foolish, and dangerous in turn. And with that, she picked up her knitting bag and walked slowly back toward the lane, as though nothing more remarkable had happened than an afternoon's quiet stroll. Chapter 11. After the bouquet. The arrest of Mrs. Latimer Senior sent ripples through Little Densworth, as surely as if a stone had been cast into the duck pond by the church. At first there was disbelief. The elegant lady with her parasols and clipped tones, guilty of such a scheme.
Impossible.
Yet, as so often in village life, impossibility quickly gave way to certainty, and by the following morning half the parish was saying they had suspected her all along. At the Blue Boar tea-room, Mrs. Pritchard leaned across her table and confided to anyone who would listen that she had once seen Mrs. Latimer glance most suspiciously at a letter in the post office. Miss Perkins, the postmistress herself, confirmed that Mrs. Latimer had always been far too secretive about her correspondence, and Mrs. Price Ridley declared that she had never trusted a woman who wore lavender at her age. Meanwhile, Clara and her young husband sought quiet refuge at her father's house. Clara, though shaken, was free of suspicion at last, and the villagers, as fickle in compassion as in blame, now spoke of her as a tragic heroine, the poor child nearly ruined by her formidable mother-in-law. Lionel Latimer walked about the village red-faced, muttering about disgrace. But there were some who said that beneath his bluster was a kind of relief, as though a long shadow had at last lifted from his home. Miss Marple, staying still a few days longer with Mrs. Weatherby, observed all this with her usual calm. "People do so enjoy rearranging the past," she remarked gently over her knitting. "Yesterday, Mrs. Latimer was admired, even envied. Today she is denounced and Clara is pitied. Yet nothing has changed but knowledge. It is always so with human nature. The flower is praised while it blooms and condemned when the petals fall." Mrs. Weatherby, sighing, poured her tea. "At least it is over, Jane. The village can be peaceful again." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, dear, until the next thorn pricks." On the Sunday following, the roses in the churchyard were in bloom again. The villagers admired them, though in hushed tones, as if wary that flowers might conceal secrets still. But Miss Marple, walking slowly among them, touched one crimson blossom lightly and said to herself, "Roses, like people, will always come again. The blossoms fade, but the roots remain, and with the roots the old troubles." Chapter 12. The last bloom. Autumn came to Little Densworth with crisp mornings and a haze of smoke above the cottages. The roses in the churchyard had faded to hips and thorns, and the grand bouquet that had caused so much scandal was already a memory, though not one easily forgotten. Clara Latimer and her husband departed for the coast, eager to leave Whispers behind. Mrs. Latimer Senior awaited trial in the county town, her once proud figure diminished, yet still clinging to dignity. And the villagers, after their first shock, began weaving the affair into the fabric of gossip that would last for years to come. Miss Marple returned quietly to St. Mary Mead. One afternoon, as she sat by her hearth with her knitting, Mrs. Bantry called upon her. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, "you do have the oddest way of being present where such dreadful things occur. Bouquets, poison, scandal. It's hardly what one expects from roses and weddings." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ah, but one should always expect it, Dolly. Roses have thorns and weddings have secrets. Human nature is very much the same in Little Densworth as anywhere else. Pride, fear, and vanity do not vanish with confetti." When Mrs. Bantry had gone, Miss Marple set down her knitting and poured herself a cup of tea. For a moment she gazed into the steam rising from the cup, the faint fragrance of roses drifting from the garden outside. "Bouquets fade," she murmured softly, "but secrets endure." And with that she sipped her tea, calm and content, as though waiting for the next pattern of human folly to reveal itself. Chapter 13. Echoes in Little Densworth by Winter. The bouquet affair had already begun to change its shape in the telling. What had once been whispered in shock was now embroidered with details, some true, most imagined. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Pritchard swore she had always distrusted Mrs. Latimer Senior. "A woman with secrets in her eyes," she insisted. Miss Perkins, behind the post-office counter, claimed she had once delivered a letter that fairly reeked of scandal, though she could not now remember to whom. Even the vicar, in a sermon on pride, let slip a phrase that made his congregation think of parasols, poisons, and wilting roses. Clara's name was spoken with sympathy now, as though the village had never doubted her. Yet Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her tea in St. Mary Mead, reflected that sympathy is often most freely given after the danger has passed. One snowy afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby wrote Miss Marple a letter. "The roses are long gone, Jane, but people here still speak of the bouquet.
It has become almost a legend, the bride's flowers that hid a note, the proud matron undone by her own hand."
We are quieter now, though I cannot say calmer. For you were right. Roots remain even when blooms are cut away. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she read it. She folded the letter, placed it neatly in her sewing box, and resumed her knitting. for life, she knew, would go on, with weddings, roses, teacups, and whispers. And somewhere, in some village, another bouquet would fade, another secret would bloom, and another proud hand would reach too far into the shadows, and when it did, she would be there to notice the smallest thread, the quietest tremor, the detail overlooked by everyone else. Chapter 14. Roses in Winter Inn, St. Mary. Mead. The garden lay bare, its roses cut back to tidy stubs, the soil dark and clean against the frost. Yet even in this seeming emptiness Miss Marple saw promise. Beneath the earth, roots waited, patient and silent, to flower again when spring returned. She sat by her parlour window with her knitting on her lap, watching a robin flit between the hedge and the empty trellis. Outside, a single late rose, pale, imperfect, its petals tinged with brown, still clung stubbornly to life. Mrs. Bantry had visited earlier that afternoon. "I shall never look at a wedding bouquet in quite the same way again, Jane," she had declared. Such dreadful things hidden among roses and ribbons. Miss Marple had only smiled. Dreadful things, dear, are hidden everywhere. Bouquets, wills, teacups, even the smallest of parcels. People imagine secrets can be disguised by beauty. But beauty only makes them stand out more, if one knows how to look. Now, in the quiet of evening, she thought of Clara Latimer and the roses of little Densworth, of Mrs. Latimer Senior and her pride, of gossip that bloomed and withered like flowers. She bent once more to her knitting. The needles clicked softly, steady as the tick of the clock. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is rather like a rosebush.
Prune it, tend it, admire its flowers, yet always beneath the thorns remain. And with that, Miss Marple smiled serene and let the twilight settle around her.
For the season would turn, and with it, sooner or later, some new mystery would bud and blossom, and she would be there, watching, ready, her gentle eyes missing nothing. Chapter 15. The village men's life in Little Densworth did not stop when Mrs. Latimer Senior was taken away, though for some weeks it seemed to walk with a limp. The villagers moved with lowered voices as though afraid to disturb the very air that had borne such shocking revelations. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Pritchard announced with solemn authority that she had always suspected something. Miss Perkins at the post office declared she had seen the bouquet being carried oddly, though she admitted she could not remember by whom, and Mrs. Price Ridley confided to anyone who would listen that she had once caught Mrs. Latimer Senior looking at her own son in such a way. Well, one knew she was capable of anything. In truth, most were less horrified by the crime itself than fascinated by the details, each embroidery more elaborate than the last. Clara and Lionel returned quietly after some weeks away, determined to begin their married life in earnest. There were whispers at first, sympathetic glances, then slowly the villagers accepted them back into the pattern of things. Clara, paler but steadier, walked arm in arm with her husband through the lanes, and little by little, curiosity gave way to the ordinary business of village life. It was only Miss Marple who noticed the faint shadows still lingering. The way Clara's eyes clouded at the sight of roses, or the stiffness in Lionel's manner when his mother's name was spoken. These, Miss Marple knew, were scars that time would not easily smooth away. One afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby said over tea, "How curious it is, Jane, that such a dreadful thing should be forgotten so quickly. People chatter for a while, then turn to the next scandal as though nothing had happened." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "It is the way of human nature, my dear."
Villages are like gardens. Weeds spring up, are cut down, and soon replaced by others.
What endures is not the shock, but the habit. The little vanities, the envies, the pride. Those things bloom again, no matter how often they are pruned. Mrs. Weatherby shivered, though the fire was warm. By summer, the roses in the churchyard once more opened in heavy bloom, their petals bright against the stone. Visitors admired them, unaware that a bride's bouquet had once been hidden among such blossoms, carrying with it both romance and ruin. And Miss Marple, knitting by her window in St. Mary Mead, reflected that beauty and danger were never far apart. The pattern would come again, as surely as roses in June, and she would be there to notice it.